Hi guys, so today we are going to talk about The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Now, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells is a classic book of all times, and it's in fact considered a precursor to the whole genre of science fiction as such. So the whole genre of what we know as science fiction began with the publication of The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, along with Jules Verne, the famous French science fiction author, are considered to be the father of science fiction. So quite a heavy reputation to live up to. To be honest, guys, when I picked up this book, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, I expected something more complex, something that would be full of a lot of technical jargon, a lot of scientific explanations of what the time machine is, how it would look like, and what would be the technology of the functioning of the time machine. So I was expecting it to be a lot more technical sounding and a lot more complex. But when I started reading this book, I actually realized I personally found it to be more belonging to the genre of fantasy than belonging to the genre of science fiction per se. The plot of The Time Machine is pretty simplistic, and the science part is actually, I think, although it's a science fiction book, it's considered to be the precursor to science fiction, but the science part is pretty weak in this book, and the only scientific stuff you hear throughout The Time Machine is in the beginning of the book, and the rest of all, it is fantasy. The rest of it is pretty brilliant and vivid imagination. So like I said, I would place this more in the genre of fantasy than science fiction. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells actually reminded me of reading George Orwell's books. The way the time machine is written, the kind of dystopia that is constructed in this book, it kind of reminds you of the Orwellian universe. Although, of course, Time Machine has a pretty simplistic plot, and it is nowhere near, Orwell's complex imagination or the kind of complex characterization that George Orwell does in his novels. But it still reminds you of Orwell's works. The sense of bleak and that bleak futuristic dystopia that is also there in The Time Machine. One more book that The Time Machine reminds me, and it's one of my favorites, this book is Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Now, those of you who have read The Handmaid's Tale would be able to connect, if you also read The Time Machine, that sense of, complete sense of bleak, that complete sense of nihilism in this bleak, futuristic dystopia is present and is so evident in both these books. Although The Handmaid's Tale is really pessimistic in its worldview, and although the Time Machine also presents a very pessimistic futuristic dystopia, but in its entirety I would regard Time Machine not as pessimistic, but more as reflective, more as something that is trying to analyze this futuristic dystopia. It's trying to analyze this future world, which is a culmination of both the progress made by human beings and the kind of subsequent degeneration that follows that progress. So the Time Machine is more philosophical in that way. It's trying to analyze, the contradictions and inconsistencies of human progress, of capitalist progress, so to say, rather than presenting us with a black and white futuristic dystopia. Coming to the story of The Time Machine, the plot is pretty simple, and the story is set in Victorian England, and it's about an English scientist who claims to have developed a time machine. The initial setting of the book is in the laboratory of this scientist and his office, where he's surrounded by his colleagues, his well-wishers, he's surrounded by his mates basically, and all of a sudden he makes this rather dramatic and startling revelation that he's actually invented a time machine. He's invented the prototype of a machine that could actually make human beings travel through the dimension of time. Now, this bit is quite funny and humorous, as nobody really believes him, and most of his friends and people he's surrounded by regard him as a lunatic. They think he's a bit crazy, or he's drunk, or he's just trying to fool people, or he's just overworked, or he is just overusing his imagination. All sorts of plausible explanations people give for his irrational and mad banter, but nobody quite believes him. But then he actually takes them to the laboratory later on, where his real time machine, initially it seemed he had shown them a small model, wherein the time machine model is complete, and then he actually hops onto that time machine, the scientist, and off he goes to the year 802701, which is quite crazy. And so far, even by today's standards, this book, by the way, was written in 1895. So even just imagine that time, to write a book which is showing a futuristic vision of the year 802701 would have been so radical and revolutionary. Even by today's standards, this year is like crazy, crazy far. So the rest of the book is about his adventures and experiences in this futuristic utopia or dystopia, whatever you choose to call it. So basically, in this futuristic world where he arrives, he meets two kinds of people, and there are two kinds of existence here. The first are the Eloi. These are the people who live above the ground, and the way the world of the Eloi has been shown, has been depicted, it's a pretty fairy tale-like universe. The nature is beautiful in all its beauty and magnanimity. They're colorful, exotic flowers of all kinds, which the time traveler has never seen in his own world, and there are all kinds of exotic flowers, vegetation. It's like a world which is so charming that it's too good to be true. There is no pollution, there is no disease, and apparently there is no death as well. So all human suffering, all human pain has ceased to be. And the creatures he meets who live in this very beautiful and magnificent world devoid of any suffering are almost childlike creatures who are very pretty, dainty, delicate, and they're fairy-like creatures, but they are very weak. As beautiful they're pretty weak creatures, and also very lazy, he realizes. All they do around the day is just dance, sing, laugh, chatter, eat and feast, and just literally fall asleep. So there's this sense of acute degeneration that is shown in the life of these above the ground creatures who are the Eloi. And the time traveler is, to be honest, quite unnerved by their existence, and he doesn't find them human. Their exuberance and this sense of permanent bliss that these people seem to live in, he just finds it too inhuman and too abnormal. They almost seem like zombies to him, because for the time traveler, the world he's coming from, human life, human emotions are as much about suffering, pain, conflict, trouble, anger, all sorts of emotions, as they are about happiness. So he finds this emotional depth completely missing in these creatures. They come across as, rather frightfully hollow and shallow creatures to him, who seem to then he later realizes they seem to be having no emotions at all. They seem to be somehow stuck in a permanent state of stupor. So he cannot humanly relate to these creatures, and he finds it quite unnerving. On the other end of the spectrum, there are the Morlocks, who are the creatures of the underground. Now, the underground world is portrayed in a rather scary way in this book, and it's really visually evocative the way the Morlocks are portrayed. They're like really scary creatures whose eyes are shining in the dark, and they've been portrayed as really dangerous and monster-like creatures who are the opposite of, the dainty and fairy-like creatures of the above the ground world. So these are the underground creatures who now wield the real power, the real influence, and the dainty and fairy-like above the ground creatures actually fall prey to the hunger and the anger of the Morlocks. So they become victims to these really strong giant-like Morlocks who live underground. So this is pretty much the gist of the story. Now, how the time traveler lands underground has another interesting tale behind it. So his time machine, the moment he actually walks into that beautiful, futuristic, utopian or dystopian universe, he realizes after a while that his time machine is nowhere to be found. He initially panics, but then he searches, and then he realizes as he deciphers that world mode that there's an underground world, and the Morlocks of the underground world have actually taken away his time machine. So the whole novel is then about how he recovers, how he takes his time machine back from those underground creatures. There's another interesting contrast here. The creatures over the ground are scared of darkness. When there's darkness, they all huddle together and sleep together because they're really scared of darkness, because darkness means the Morlocks approaching them. The underground creatures, in contrast, are scared of the light. So whenever they see a light is shining in their eyes, they pretty much run away. So the book tells us how a couple of matchsticks actually, having access to matchsticks comes to the aid of the time traveler who saves himself from Morlocks and manages to outwit them to ultimately retrieve his time machine and leave that nasty world for good. So this is pretty much the gist of the book. Of course, there are many surprises and adventures in the time machine. I'm not going to reveal to you the entire plot, but this is basically the gist of the book. Now, many interpretations of the book, most of the interpretations of the time machine actually tell us that the over the ground futuristic world, that is the world where these fairy-like and dainty creatures live, is representative of the degenerate aristocracy, the ruling class, the rich people, the ultra-rich people of those times, so to say, who, because of the excesses of capitalism, who have degenerated into this kind of state where they're rendered completely effeminate and childlike, because humanity has reached such an extreme state of progress that all problems, all issues have been solved. There is no inequality, there are no social problems, there is no pollution, there are basically no issues or problems. So these people pretty much have nothing to do and they've degenerated into this state of stupor and inertia. The underground people are the representative of the working class who actually do all the labor, who actually do all the production work, and the Morlocks are the representative of the working class poor. The working class poor in this futuric dystopia have degenerated equally, and they've degenerated into these monsters who are forever preying on the effeminate creatures, prying on the effeminate creatures of the above ground. And the working class, these working class Morlocks are the ones who wield the actual power now, but they've become so violent and cruel and irrational. So this is basically the, more or less the larger overarching framework in which this book is interpreted, and it does make sense also. The author himself, the time traveler himself, says in the book that he notices that the creatures above the ground never seem to be doing any work. So where are all these comforts coming from? Then when he visits the underground, he realizes that the Morlocks are the ones, the underground creatures are the ones who are probably doing the actual labor, and that's where the aristocratic class, they must be the representative of the aristocratic class, the above the ground people, because that's where they seem to be getting all their comforts from. So this is more or less the binary between the above the ground creatures and the below the ground creatures. Now at this point, I would like to tell you something about H.G. Wells' life, in the light of which the time machine would probably make more sense to you. So H.G. Wells is someone who came from a very humble working class background. Both his parents were domestic servants who later turned on small shopkeepers. So H.G. Wells is someone who saw that conflict between the English working class and the English aristocracy from real close quarters. He himself struggled a lot in his life for everything, for getting education, then employment. He first got a job as a draper, then a chemist assistant, and then a school teacher, till he somehow managed to get a scholarship to study biology at a London college. After graduating from the London University, he became a science teacher. So we can perhaps appreciate the division between the Morlocks and the Eloi more in the light of H.G. Wells' own life trajectory, that since he saw poverty and the working class life from such close quarters, and he also saw the ways of the aristocracy, so that critique of the critique of the Victorian establishment, so to say, that got embedded in his consciousness, and that's what finds critical expression in this separation, acute separation of the world of the underground and the above the ground in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. To be honest, had I not read about H.G. Wells' working class credentials, the fact that he came from a working class background, I would have felt quite uncomfortable by his characterization of the underground creatures in The Time Machine, and I found that quite a bit problematic. because if his concern is ultimately with the portrayal of the working class and the way, working class poor have been affected due to extreme capitalism, then its logical conclusion would have been to have a bit of sympathy towards the working class poor. But this completely dehumanizes the working class poor, and the way the Morlocks have been portrayed in the Time Machine, anybody reading the Time Machine would end up sympathizing with the Eloi rather than the Morlocks, because they've been really dehumanized. They've been portrayed as these monsters, and the Eloi, even though the Eloi are also degenerate creatures, but they get our wave of sympathy as they are the ones who fall prey to the abnormal hunger of the underground creatures. So to me, it's not really a fair depiction in terms of the working class and the poor people. That's just my opinion. So had I not known about his working class background, I would have been very uncomfortable about this characterization. But then in the light of his own his own life struggles and his own life trajectory, one can probably say that through this depiction and through this binary, he is trying to talk about the extreme violence and chaos inflicted by the excesses of capitalism. But still, this is something, the portrayal of the underground Morlocks is something which I find very confusing in the Time Machine, and I cannot reconcile to it. Also, one more interesting thing I discovered about the author H.G. Wells is that he was quite critical of the British colonization project, the empire, so to say, and especially in the context of the British colonizing India, he was quite a vocal critic. So that's something again then, which lends light to the symbolism of the Time Machine, and this futuristic dystopia perhaps can be also, the underground and the overground people can also then become the colonizers and the colonized. But then again, the same problem that I had with the depiction of the Morlocks as working class, I would have the same discomfiture if we were to categorize Morlocks as the colonized people. But that apart, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells is a pretty good book to read. The language is very simple, easy to understand. It's also very descriptive and animated. So when the time traveler is describing to you this whole world, this whole futuristic dystopian crazy world he travels to, you can actually start visualizing that world. The world is right there in front of your eyes, and especially the section when he's describing these creatures of the underground, the shining eyes of the Morlocks and the way they have their hands all over him, it's sort of, the description is so powerful that you actually start feeling scared, and that sense of morbidity, it completely creeps into your consciousness as well. Plus the description of the when he reaches this futuristic dystopia and when he sees the over the ground world, and the fact that there are these exotic flowers, the nature is so beautiful, but there's somewhere always some kind of sense of inertia, some kind of sense of danger lurking through, and it's almost like I said, it's almost like too good to be true. So there is a sense that humanity is nearing its doom, lurking through that supposedly beautiful atmosphere, bucolic worldview also, and that feeling, I think, has been portrayed very strongly, very powerfully in this book. So I would certainly recommend you The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. It's a classic. You must definitely read it. In fact, reading this book inspired me to read proper science fiction. I'm not now going to read many science fiction books and review the same. Hope it's going to do the same to you. So guys, thank you so much for listening. That's it for today. If you like the content, please press the like button and please do subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.